The Supreme Court takes on campaign finance, a new report on climate change, Obamacare sign-up numbers, and a CEO resigns over his views on gay marriage. I'm Daniel Chawla, and this is a Square Circle. Hello, and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Daniel Chawla. Joining us today are Ankur Chawla of Young Voices Advocates and political strategist and PhD student from Rice University, James Hedrick. Welcome.
Thank you.
First up this week is the big decision from the Supreme Court. In McCutcheon versus the FEC, the court struck down limits on the amounts individuals may donate each cycle to candidates, parties, and political action committees, although it left in place limits for individuals to specific candidates. Critics of this decision claim that it's the death knell for democracy in America, but defenders say it upholds free speech. James, where do you stand on this?
I think with this issue, you've got to stand with the integrity of the electoral system, and I think it's under threat at this point. I think that we already have a problem with the electoral system being able to hear and translate the views of young people, minorities, many other people that aren't actively engaged in the political system. And I think that this is only going to make that worse. There's going to be more groups chasing more dollars. They're going to be talking to fewer individuals, and they're going to be able to get their money from fewer individuals, and that's just going to make the echo chamber worse. And I think that as a PhD candidate, I don't know if anybody else or anybody watching has ever read Schatzsnyder, but there's an old comment that the pluralist chorus sings with an upper class accent, and I think that this decision is only going to make that worse.
Ankur?
So I think there's this myth that comes with campaign finance limits, and this sort of myth that campaign finance kills the democratic process. Empirical studies have shown time and time again that campaign finance contributions don't actually correlate very highly with political power, wins and losses, right? So what I'm interested in when it comes to this argument is the empirical argument. I'm not interested in the ideological, whether campaign finance limits are right or wrong. I'm thinking what I'm much more interested in is the political ramifications. So it is a fact that campaign finance limits benefit incumbents because individual donors can give, I think, $48,000 in total contributions to political campaigns and something around $70,000 towards parties. Parties often give money back to re-election campaigns, and of course that makes sense, right? Parties and incumbents have these backroom deals. They go together. The incumbents vote for these campaign finance limits, and the money that goes to parties comes back to the incumbents. So I think the Supreme Court decision was actually very meaningful in the sense that it sort of did away with allowing the political system to choose winners and losers.
I think there's two issues that come up there. First, the concept of winning and losing. I think that one of the issues that comes up with campaign finance reform, and particularly issues like this, where you've got large money donors being able to be larger money donors, is the fact that wins and losses aren't as important when you're not playing a game. All right, and I think that what you get with money in politics is not so much you're going to win. Money doesn't correlate directly with winning. That is an empirical finding. What money correlates is what we're fighting over in the first place. And I think that when we're fighting over whether or not Comcast or NBC, I think they're the same one now actually, but if it's Comcast versus NBC, like I said, they may be the same one, or ABC or Disney or what have you. When those two are fighting and that money doesn't correlate with wins or losses, I don't think that's an argument that you should allow more money in politics. I think that you've got large money individuals fighting over. Those are the fights that we have. Those are the issues that we're talking over. And the second one, and I just want to come back to this, is not so much an ideological or empirical point as it is a point of the integrity of the system and whether or not people believe and understand. That was Breyer's dissent in the McCutcheon. That was his problem with it, is that whether or not the people that are participating in the electoral system find this and view this to be corrupt. And I think that that's a major problem, and one that's difficult to figure out from empirical numbers.
I mean, bringing up corruption for campaign finance limits is interesting to me because I find that the campaign finance limits that were instituted in the first place are quote unquote corrupt in the sense that individual donors can give only a certain amount of money towards campaign elections, but PACs, right? PACs can give way more money towards political campaigns. So why is it that these giant institutions? So like you can have the richest of the rich in America fund these PACs, and that money goes into political campaigns, but you can't have individual donors.
It goes into state parties and party profits.
And I think that, frankly, this whole argument about the electoral process being under sort of threat, I don't buy it. I think that there's not much money in election campaigns, right? It sounds like a lot when you say there's $2 billion, $3 billion going into presidential election campaigns. But look at the budget, like the U.S. budget on an annual. I think 0.1% of the budget is how much money that goes into political campaigns. There's not much money involved. So as far as the threat to the electoral process, I think this is a rather minor issue. And I think that campaign finance limits are simply a way for incumbents to keep power and cause political stagnation, which is highly problematic on multiple levels.
Yeah, and I don't, and don't misunderstand me. I'm not defending the current campaign finance reform system. We could pivot to a discussion of public funding of elections, but I understand where you're coming from, and I think it's an important point. But I think that really what you've come to is there's not as much money in politics as there should be, as much as you would think, given, like you were saying, the budgetary restrictions, and that's largely because it just doesn't take that much.
Sure.
To win it takes about $1 million a day. It takes about $1 million a week, give or take, to run a decent house race or something, and that's not as difficult to get as you'd think. But what I'm coming back to the same point as we were discussing wins and losses and the empirical things is the people putting that money in, all right, are getting something out for it, and they're putting it in for a reason. And the reason that they're putting it in is because they have a stake in the system, whatever that system may be. All right, if Comcast or ABC put money into the system and contribute candidates, they have issues with that come up with the Federal Communications Commission, or they have issues with laws that are passed over net neutrality. All right, they're not donating money out of the goodness of their hearts because they enjoy democracy so much. All right, and I think that what you get when you get something like this, when you get something with campaign finance reform, it may be just a smaller step in a bad direction. All right, but what it is opening up the fact that the echo chamber is just getting smaller and smaller.
Well, since you opened up the can of worms about public funding, go ahead. What are your thoughts on that?
I honestly think that we should eliminate private money and have a fully publicly funded campaign system.
All right. Well, I think if we look at the U.S. Constitution, we have something called freedom of speech, and I think freedom of speech is a huge issue, right? And campaign finance contributions towards candidates is largely a freedom of speech issue, right? This is within like the text that we hold most dear to this country tells us that this is a freedom of speech issue. Not only that, it's a freedom of association issue. Look. If you want to eliminate public funding into campaigns, what's going to happen? You're going to have people donating. You're going to have rich people starting media firms and influencing campaigns that way. Why is the media allowed to not have any limits?
I'm not entirely sure that's not actually the case right now.
Oh, it absolutely is the case, right? You're right. So why is it that the media can have no limits on how much it can influence campaigns, but individuals can? We're talking about individuals here, right?
I think that comes back to a good point. The media does influence campaigns.
Sure.
I think what you're talking about right now with these large campaign contributions is that the media that people see and the messages that they hear are largely determined by how much money is thrown at them. And I think that you're not talking anymore about individuals, smaller individuals, being able to contribute $50 or $100 to a campaign. All right, we're talking about people being able to move from being able to contribute hundreds of thousands to millions across the board. You could at this point under this decision. I think you're still got the individual limits on state campaigns, so you could spend $500,000 just contributing to state campaigns. Easy. That's a drop in the bucket for somebody. It's going to take me better part of a decade. I don't know how long it's going to take me, but it'd take me a long time just to earn $50,000, much less spend it.
So that's interesting. So we were talking about individual donors. Now we're talking about sort of like the rich people, the rich institutions that influence political campaigns. So let's look at 2012, right? The Koch brothers put tons of money into campaigns, PACs, individual donors. They did everything they could, and Republicans still lost pretty much across the board. Political power does not correlate with very well, like I mentioned, with donations and contributions to campaigns.
Victories and losses in electoral things don't correlate because you also usually have money coming in on the other side. I'm talking about the fact that the Koch brothers may not have won, but they certainly affected the conversation. And I don't think that you can argue that they didn't affect the conversation. That's not, in my humble opinion, an issue of freedom of speech.
So that makes sense, and that's a very much ideological argument. And like I mentioned, I'm not as interested in ideological arguments. I'm more interested in the political ramifications. And I think somebody using their financial resources to use freedom of speech is to say what they think is right or wrong is something that's totally should be allowed within our society. Look, freedom of speech doesn't exist in the private space. It doesn't exist in someone's home, right? Freedom of speech is instituted because of the political space. The political space is where the freedom of speech is something that should be protected. If we didn't have a political space, then freedom of speech wouldn't matter. What matters is that we have to protect the ability for individuals and organizations to be able to say what they think in the political space, and that translates very closely with campaign contributions.
All right, let's move on. I'd like to remind our audience, we'll come back to that another day, but it's a very, very good point. I'd like to remind our audience that they can submit their questions to our guests on our website, www.publicsquare.net. And we'll answer as many as we can live on the air today towards the end of the show. Also in the news this week was a new report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which warned about the coming economic damages from a changing climate. Some, however, are saying that the IPCC is overstating the effects. Ankur, should we be worried about climate change?
I think it's an issue we should be worried about, actually. I think that the IPCC report shows us the failures of climate change policy in the last 25 years. And you can see that in the report when it summarizes that we have to learn to adapt and live with climate change as it stands today because we've not been able to stop it yet. So let's look at the political and policy history of climate change policy. Look, we have $500 billion in annual subsidies that go towards fossil fuels each year, right? We are path dependent on this industry. We have, for better or for worse, the government and these fossil fuel corporations have put $500 billion a year into this market, which makes really high barriers to entry for clean energy alternatives. Clean energy cannot innovate if its competitors have a $500 billion head start on them. So we haven't been able to see clean energy happen, and as a result of government corporate collusion. Corporate welfare has stymied market innovation, and it's resulted in a lack of clean energy alternatives. So I think that a unilateral policy approach, as we've tried to do in the past, is incorrect for two reasons, right? Number one, this corporate welfare is the state of things, the status quo, and there's no indications that's going to change, especially if you look at how the lobbying interest works in Washington. Secondly, I think a federal policy towards fossil fuels, like the Obama administration's policy towards fossil fuels, is really different from the state and local policies towards fossil fuels. Most of the subsidies that go into fossil fuels comes from state and local governments. So a unilateral policy response is just untenable in our political and economic framework. So we have to look at tenable solutions, right? We have to look at solutions that are actually going to work, and I think that market-based private property solutions are the best. When you look at for instance, deforestation. Deforestation causes just as much carbon emission as cars and trucks globally, right? But deforestation is a large result of this phenomenon called tragedy of the commons, which is the notion that the state and federal government owns large swaths of land. They give state permits to lumber companies to come in and destroy the forest. But if there was private property there, then these companies would sustain their land. They'd keep it together, and they wouldn't destroy something that's their product, right? The deforestation. It shows, like, there are reports that show that the deforestation would decrease dramatically if it weren't for tragedy of the commons.
I agreed with you on almost all points right up until the private property solution, which I don't think it's gonna work. If you read the research, if you read the literature on the tragedy of the commons, I'm pretty sure that none of our viewers out there really actually want to go into that, because it is a long bunch of research. The problem with the tragedy of the commons is that everyone has an incentive to take everything for everybody else does, and private property doesn't solve that problem. Private property only parcels it up. So honestly, if you do have a private property solution, what you end up with is deforested areas and people moving on to the next deforested area. I think that what you want to do, if you want some sort of, and I can to a certain extent see your idea of a non-unilateral, and I assume by that meaning federally directed solutions, because you've seen a lot of success in places like California with subsidies for buying a variety of green energy alternatives, which I think is completely reasonable. I think what you have to get down to with something like this, though, is instituting something along the. If you want a true market solution, and it's something that I don't think that this is particularly analogous with deforestation and the tragedy of the commons, unfortunately. But what I think that you want to get with some sort of market solution like this is you have to institute carbon tax. And that you honestly have to tax the production of something that you don't like, therefore incentivizing the reduction in the use thereof.
I don't actually disagree with you on that. Yeah. I think that carbon tax and things like cap and trade move towards the right direction. Insofar as, so if you have a company that's polluting a local area, then it makes total sense from a private property standpoint to pay for the negative externality of pollution, right? This is the polluter's pay principle. This makes a lot of sense to me, if that you have some sort of tax instituted on negative externalities, but on a community basis, though, right? This is for communities. If looking at it from a negative externality standpoint, it makes it a much more layered, robust way to look at it, as opposed to some sort of top-down approach.
You're right on negative externalities, and the problem with the negative externality argument is the fact that you have to make the pay harsh enough because you don't want the negative externality. The purpose of the policy is to eliminate the negative externality, not to allow. No, I think the purpose of the policy should be to eliminate the negative externality, or at least minimize it significantly if you want something like reduction in carbon. The problem with that is you have to escalate the tax so high that no one would do the externality, but keeping it so low, what you're going to do is incentivize people to go ahead, do it, and then pay it. And I don't want people dumping sulfur in the water and then going ahead and paying a $20 fine and being able to get away with it. Because negative externality has to be paid for, and I think it has to be paid for to be eliminated. So I think that when you do something like cap and trade, you incentivize the being able to sell. There's a certain incentive at that point to actually just continue doing what you're doing that is bad. And I think that for the carbon tax, it's actually a pretty simple solution and make it highly escalating. A couple tons of carbon, I got no problem with that. 10, 20, 100 tons of carbon, it starts to get such that you no longer have a profit.
All right. So look, we can't eliminate pollution, right? We consume goods as a society that are a result of oil, coal, energy, right?
I understand that.
So there's an optimal level of pollution here, and that sounds terrible, but the point is to lower it, not eliminate it, right? So this is where the community-based cap and trade approach is actually really meaningful. A community can decide how much to tax a corporation to use. You use local goods, right? And to use and to cause pollution, and that means that if companies don't want to pay that, then they can decide to sort of become more clean. So a community can decide contractually with local companies that pollute how much it's going to cost them to stay there and continue to pollute. So communities can self-regulate in that sense.
This is a basic economic argument, and there's the basic economic argument of voting with your feet. The problem with the community-based approach that you're arguing is I have no problem with it being a portion of the solution and one's having flexibility around particular issues. The problem with the community-based non-universal approach, at least within a nation, is the fact that if I can pollute in Rockville, I can't pollute in D.C., I'm going to go move to Rockville. All right, and most companies have a lot more flexibility in their ability to move than many others do, and you're going to end up with, I believe, a race to the bottom. You see, an analogous example might actually be gambling, in the state and states agreeing to have gambling. Mississippi has gambling. Louisiana has gambling. Then Mississippi gets gambling because all the gambling dollars are going to Louisiana. I think that you're going to get the same thing with polluters. If you've got lower restrictions in Louisiana, you're going to get moving there.
I'm not sure if that metaphor works very well because gambling is not a limited resource, right? Oil, coal, energy is a limited resource. So there's only so much energy that that is available, right? And there's plenty of companies. The market's huge for energy that are
we're
already.
We're not talking about this at this point. The market for energy or coal is not what's affecting the move. At that point, it's what comes out at the back end is the burning of the coal or that. And so the fact is not that can be, as much as you want it to be, essentially endless at this point.
All right, let me ask you one question before we move on. Just your quick thoughts on the Keystone. What should we do? What should be done?
Oh, honestly, I'm going to say build the thing.
I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think the pipeline is a lot cheaper way to transport.
No, I mean, we're not getting. I tend to agree with you. I mean, we're not moving to a solar and wind-based economy tomorrow. I think you build the pipeline. I think the only real problem, and the one that gets environmentalists, and I understand this, is that the tar sands, where a lot of it's going to be coming from, is exceptionally polluting. Mm-hmm. So the oil that's going to come out of there is going to be exceptionally polluting, relatively speaking.
That's until the market innovates.
Until the market innovates and finds. I don't think we can dump for tar or carbon sinks. I'm not sure we can do that with tar and whatnot. I think
All right. So also this week, the Obama administration announced that over 7 million people have signed up for Obamacare, but a new report from the Rand Corporation shows that the number who have actually paid premiums may be less than $1 million. Did the White House pull an April Fool's Day prank on the American public? Ankur?
Sure. So this is a funny policy. This is a funny number that came out from the White House. It tells us that the goal of Obamacare to work is 7 million signups, but this number hides a lot of the facts. And I think when Obama had his press conference, he didn't take any questions for a reason. For instance, there are not 7 million Americans that are now insured under Obamacare. There are not 7 million more Americans now insured overall, because about 6 million Americans lost their policy because Obamacare banned it, and many of them opted back into Obamacare. So Rand Corp tells us, this report tells us, that less than 2 million Americans total Americans have gained insurance due to Obamacare. The Rand Corp study also estimates that about 1 million Americans are newly uninsured because they had their policy canceled and weren't able to opt back in. Furthermore, we don't actually know how many of the people who opted into Obamacare are paid their first premium. Rand Corp estimates under 1 million. The numbers are shady, but what we do know is the White House isn't telling us that. But overall, I think this issue kind of takes the conversation away from takes the conversation away from the real issue at hand and keeps it in this argument of raw numbers. The issue at hand is generational wealth redistribution. For about 38 to 40% of young people have to opt in to Obamacare. 38 to 40% of people who opt in have to be young in order to cover the costs of older people. That's highly problematic to me. Young people are straddled with debt already as it is. Giving them this extra burden is not something that we should endeavor to do in our society. Also, Obamacare is, on some level, corporate welfare, right? Like I was just talking to James before the show. We both don't necessarily like the situation as it is. I don't know. You can speak to that a little more if you want.
Not particularly.
But we both have our own solutions. But the situation as it is now is corporations are now have the entire American public who are being forced to buy their one service. So it's highly problematic on that level as well.
No, actually, I tend to agree, and I have to admit that the numbers are honestly pretty shady. We're not going to honestly know for a while whether or not the numbers are going to be good or not. Quite honestly, because there's also the issue of the Medicaid subsidies that are part of I would like to call it the Affordable Care Act. Obamacare also, it makes it sound like I'm talking bad about it now after a couple of years, but there are not in the numbers. The numbers hide a couple of things, and I agree with you here. Your issues seem to be more ideological. Mine have a tendency to hide the fact that there are some good things in there. Mm-hmm. Coverage under your parents' insurance until you're 26. You talk about young people, it's the ability to afford health care, not whether or not you want it. Number one cause bankruptcy is health care. Mm-hmm. All right, is health care costs. Most of those have a tendency to be younger when they go bankrupt. They have the tendency not to have the insurance in the first place. It doesn't count the Medicaid, which I think the expansion of Medicaid is a good thing. I think it's expanded through the states. That ought to make libertarians at least mildly happy, if not me. And there's some good things about the ACA, but it comes back to the forced payment. I don't know if there's. I mean, we've already had the decision on it was under the taxing, under the taxing provision. So it's a tax and not sort of a forced purchase of supplies. And there's competition in the marketplace. The original idea was to have competition among insurers to insure people they wouldn't otherwise, insure. I think overall the steps in place are a good thing. I don't think it's going to survive in its current form. for a while. I think it's going to probably be updated and changed quite a bit over the next couple of years as some of these things get dropped out. But then that comes back to the issue of generational wealth distribution, which I don't disagree with you on any particular point. But I think if you want to talk about generational wealth distribution, which is young people paying money to old folks, then Social Security is a pretty decent example. If you want to change that, I think you really got to, we've pivoted from Obamacare and we're about to talk about higher education loans and student loans. But I think that's where you're talking about younger folks being saddled with debt.
Well,
I think that would be your major concern, is to have a lot more government subsidy of higher education.
I mean, you can call the Affordable Care Act a tax or whatever, but in the end, it's a bunch of corporations that have the entire American public who have to opt in to their company, right? Mm-hmm. We know that before the system, the reason everyone was mad at high healthcare premiums and HMOs was because these corporations were subsidized. Pharmaceutical companies were highly subsidized. They were the state colluded with them on very meaningful ways that caused very little competition in the marketplace. To say that now we have the Affordable Care Act has competition in the marketplace via this sort of state parameters, I think is highly problematic. There's very little competition.
Oh, it certainly wouldn't have been my solution if I'd been writing the law.
What's your solution?
Perhaps we'll go back to that discussion we were having earlier. Yeah, I don't think subsidizing corporations to offer people health care to a population they wouldn't normally otherwise do is a particularly useful incentive. I think what would be a useful incentive is a single-payer system and essentially enroll everybody into Medicare if they don't have insurance.
I would prefer a single-payer system to the system that we have today. That being said, my real preference is I got to go back to the communities, a community-based system that allows people on local levels to choose how much healthcare they want and to choose, even at the political level, what kind of policies they want. As opposed to, I don't like the corporate system as it was prior to the Affordable Care Act. Single-payer system is better, but still not preferable to me. I think the best way is to let state and local polities decide.
I think that anything that I can see that. I can see the point there for wanting local control. But I think that essentially what we're talking about is health. Well, talking about healthcare, what we're essentially talking about is health insurance, and all it is insurance. And insurance is nothing but an actuarial game.
Sure.
And there are economies of scale that come in with insurance, which requires a national approach. Once you break it down to the community level, it becomes the inefficiency and loss across the board is going to just make it ridiculously difficult to handle. It comes back, what you end up with is a system like we had before there was any health care in the United States, where it was Catholic Charities running lots of the hospitals, and indigent care was largely charity-based. And that's not a good health care system. That doesn't allow you preventative care, that doesn't allow you a whole bunch of things that you should get. Contraception, preventative care, education, that doesn't allow for that. And I think you get a community-based approach. That's exactly what you're going to get.
So you're saying we have inefficiencies when it comes to community-based approach?
I think
because of due to economies of scale. Mm-hmm. Sure, but it must be admitted that there are inefficiencies on the national level too.
No argument there.
Yeah, corporations on the national level. First of all, the corporate system we had prior to Affordable Care Act was very inefficient, right? Even after economies of scale, HMOs cost a lot. And now you look at Obamacare today, and we don't even know the price of premiums year
that are going to be
down the line,
next year.
No, right. So they're variable, right? That's very problematic. If we're gonna have a system that's a national policy, then we should know the price of premiums. We shouldn't have to worry that the premiums are going to go up.
I think that you look, the United States has about double the cost per patient of pretty much any Western industrialized country, give or take. It's a little over $6,000.
Why is that?
I largely think because we don't have a single payer system. But I think that with a community-based approach, one, you're not even going to be able to measure that, and I think that you're going to see that skyrocket. I don't think a community-based approach is going to limit the amount of money we're pouring into the healthcare system. It's just going to scatter it.
Well, I'm not saying. So what I'm saying is that the community-based approach is couched by this notion of not subsidizing healthcare companies, right? Not having corporate collusion, not having corporate welfare. If there's a competitive marketplace, then community-based approch on a political level is, I think, much more tenable. Single-payer system is such a radical change from how markets work. I don't find it to be a sustainable system at all.
Everyone in the VA and everyone over 65 in this country, and lots of people that are under the poverty line are included in in a single-payer system if it's not in any way a radical distribution. Plus, the VA gets incredibly good outcomes for theirs comparatively to the similar, done in empirical studies, compared to similar people with similar demographics that are not in the VA system, which is essentially a government-run single-payer system.
All right. On that note, finally, Mozilla CEO Brandon Ike resigned this week after news came out that he made a small donation years ago to an anti-gay marriage group. The dating site OkCupid initiated a boycott of Mozilla's Firefox browser, and an uproar ensued. Was this a case of Americans standing for equality, or is this a demand for tolerance going too far? James?
I'll tell you, it's we're talking about the market at work. This is exactly the market at work. You can't say dumb things, and you can't say dumb things in public. Well, that's the thing is, like, I kind of feel for the guy. I really do. Mm-hmm. I don't agree with him in any way, shape, or form, but I kind of feel bad for the guy. He did this years ago. He didn't make public comments, but he made his company look bad, and his company did exactly what a publicly traded company that's interested in profits did, which is ditch him and go find somebody else that doesn't make him look bad. And That's the market at work, man.
I mean, I absolutely agree. That's exactly what I was about to say, actually. This is the market at work. It's beautiful, right? That corporations have a public interest now. Like, corporations look at virtues in our society. We have social tolerance is a virtue. OkCupid looks at that and tries to do advocacy through peer pressure, right? Through its consumers. People vote with their dollar. This is the marketplace, right? This is how the market works. When libertarians talk about the market, we're talking about individuals and groups and people making decisions that influence their society around them. If they want people want to live the way that they value and according to the virtues that they value, they can do it through the marketplace. And this is a beautiful example of that. I think this is an example of corporate social responsibility in the best way. And I think that OkCupid did a remarkable thing, pressuring Mozilla into letting go of its CEO. So I don't know. We're not going to disagree on that.
I don't think so. They got a lot of free media in the process too. OkCupid did a pretty good for themselves on that one. I got to say.
I think so.
That's right.
I trust the cynical nature of the firm rather than the socially responsible one. But
again, I don't look at incentives as much as I look at I don't look at what the incentives of the firm are as much as I look at how they respond to things. Right. So what matters to me is how firms respond to things, and I think this speaks to actually the intrinsically sort of tied up nature, the amalgamation of markets, politics, culture, right? Mm-hmm. Markets cannot be separated from politics and culture. Markets influence politics and culture. Culture influences markets. It all comes together. So I think a lot of times when libertarians are talking about markets, they're talking about it couched in this framework of like civil society, culture, and politics. And I think it's a very beautiful example of the market at work.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right, let's take some questions from our viewers. We have a question here from Penny Watkins. Since China and India are not interested in reducing their carbon emissions, isn't anything we do here futile? Gentlemen?
Ankur?
So first of all, I think that the United States needs to lead by example on some level. The U.S., I don't know the exact numbers on this, but has like 5% of the world's population or something, and
approximately 25% of the carbon emissions.
Yeah, so
give or take.
There's a wide discrepancy there, and if the U.S. can come with a layered approach to limiting carbon emissions through, in my opinion, the marketplace and private property and polluter pay principles and fighting tragedy of the commons, etc., then I think that. Because we're a democracy, and because places like India, which is a democratic order, looks to America for a lot of the ways that it conducts itself, I think that's a really meaningful way to reduce carbon emissions. Mm-hmm. Also, the U.S. is the entity that causes the most carbon emissions. So we should look at the U.S. for limiting, as opposed to India and China. China emits a lot as well, but
and I actually I largely agree. We have the China and India in the developing world has the fastest growth in emissions and also the fastest growth in their economies, and those two are highly correlated. But we do still have the most emissions in absolute terms, and I do think that there's a certain portion of leading by example that one has to do. Plus, in absolute terms, you reduce the amount of emissions in the United States, you're going to keep it lower or drop them or at least level it off with the fast growth. The other issue is in China, neither China or India is probably going to be the place where you're going to find the innovation of things that are going to be cleaner burning fuels or less polluting fuels in the first place. The United States, I think, has the scientific community that's necessary, the engineers, and engineering, et cetera, and the market to basically spur innovation in green technologies overall. I don't think you're going to get that out of developing countries. They're too busy developing.
Right. Yeah. And I will just say really quick that you're right. It's innovation in green technologies, clean energies that are going to be the way we fight carbon emissions. It's not going to be a political, a large policy change, right? If we want to innovate and we want to find clean energy solutions, this is a market solution, right? Yes, you use politics. We use politics to create the right parameters for markets to innovate clean energy.
Okay, wonderful. Now another question from Roman Phillips: if the political system is rigged, then why don't capitalists have a monopoly on government? James?
I would argue. I think at this point the capitalists do have a monopoly on government. Man, that's a long question. I've taken a lot of political science courses in my day, and I still don't think I know the full answer to that question. I think that what you do see, though, and the U.S. system tends to lend itself toward the U.S. electoral system tends to lend itself toward favoring money in politics and favoring money's ability to buy message in politics. And this comes back to the point that we were having in the first question, is it's not so much whether you're winning or losing, it's what you're fighting about. And I think that you see in a lot of other countries in which there's a lot less money in politics, where there's a much broader political base, where there's multi-party systems. All right, that should make my libertarian friends happy, except that we'd have to amend the Constitution to do it. I think when you see those, you see a lot more debate and a lot more engagement with lower middle class, with young people. I think you see a lot more engagement and a lot more debate of the issues that are of concern to them in the first place. I think in the U.S. system, what we're fighting about, what the agenda is largely geared toward high-income capitalists.
I don't like this question. I think that I think that calling a political system rigged by capitalists is wrong, because capitalism, or the way I
think it's rigged. If it's rigged, why doesn't it favor capitalists? I think why don't they win all the time? I think.
Well, okay, you can call capitalists what you like, but this is not markets, right? The political system and corporate welfare is not markets. This is corporations, and this is. I am totally against corporations working with government to lobby the government to get sort of subsidies, etc. Right? That's not capitalism, right? That's not free markets at work by any means. This public choice theory tells us this. This is concentrated benefits, dispersed costs, right? So this is the political system. This is not a market. Like I will again go back to communities and say, if we have more federalism, if we have people on local levels deciding what kind of economic and political transactions they want, that's going to cause a lot less rigging of the political system, and it's going to cause a lot less corporate welfare that you see on the federal level.
All right, let's go to the last question here from Gina Brewer. How come the total contribution limit per cycle is unconstitutional, but the limit you can give to one candidate is not? James?
Because it hasn't come up before the Supreme Court yet. I think the only reason it's not unconstitutional is because that case hasn't made it up to the Supreme Court yet. I think that you see with Citizens United, I think you see with McCutcheon, I think you see with a couple of other decisions, we're moving in that way to an the ability to spend unlimited amounts of money. And I think that the only reason, and to your question, Gene, I think the only reason it's not unconstitutional is we haven't gotten to it yet. Okay. I think it'll come up next time.
I agree. Well, I think that the constitutionality of campaign limits, contribution limits, has actually been questioned by this most recent Supreme Court case, and I think that, like James said, the constitutionality is going to be decided if this comes up in the Supreme Court.
Okay, wonderful. Now it's time for the most unreported story of the week. James?
I don't know if it's the most unreported story of the week, but I haven't seen it a little bit. Northwestern certifying and having a union certified for their NCAA players. I may have actually been last week, but I've been traveling quite a bit. So, but I actually think that we're talking about politics and we think about we're just talking about capitalism and labor and capitalism. I mean, that's going to cause a huge shakeup. Think of March Madness. Think of NCAA football.
Sure.
I mean, this is bringing in all those sports, and if you have to start, and I'm not going to throw my 2 cents in there. I think if you sell their jersey, you probably ought to pay them a little bit for it. But I think that's going to cause a huge. thing, and it's going to have to go to the national board too. So
that's right. Yes, sir.
What I want to bring up is civil asset forfeiture. I think one of the most egregious things I've heard all week, if not all year, is this what's happening. This is on Slate. What's happening in Colorado and Washington with there are federal police colluding with local police doing civil asset forfeiture, meaning they seize things that are illegal, like marijuana. They're seizing marijuana from individuals, even though it's legal on the state level. It's illegal on the federal level. So federal police are seizing this, giving it to local police, and they're selling it off to dispensaries to raise money for criminal justice costs. I think that's egregious, and I think it's something that people should talk about a lot more.
Interesting. All right, that's all for this week. I want to thank our guests for being here. Thanks for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.